Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really fascinating journey. We're going into the world of non-classical logic.
Yeah, it's definitely off the beaten path of standard logic.
Think of it like exploring what happens when we, loosen the usual rules about truth and contradiction.
Exactly.
Our mission today is to get a handle on some properly mind-bending ideas, like, can a statement actually be true and false at the same time?
It sounds counterintuitive, I know.
We're going to figure this out by looking at the work of, the brilliant logician Graham Priest and some others in this area, too.
Priest is definitely a central figure.
We've got bits from his books like An Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, Beyond the Limits of Thought, Doubt Truth to be a Liar, In Contradiction, and his stuff on the law of non-contradiction itself.
It's a rich set of sources to draw from.
So yeah, prepare for some definite aha moments as we push the boundaries of logical thinking.
It's a landscape that really challenges some very deep assumptions about reasoning. Priest's work especially, it pushes us to think about alternatives, things we just take for granted,
Right.
And by engaging with these ideas, you can get a much richer feel for the power and maybe the limits of logic itself.
Okay, so if we're going beyond classical rules, what are the absolute basics, the foundations of this non-classical place you need to understand first?
Well, at its core, logic is always about what follows from what, right?
Right.
Formally, we often talk about interpretations. Think of an interpretation as like a specific way the world could be, a scenario. Some things are true in it, others false. An argument's valid if it preserves truth across all these possible scenarios, in all interpretations.
Okay.
Now, a key thing here is how we deal with not. Classically, if something's not possible, it must be necessarily false.
Makes sense.
And if it's not necessarily true, it must be possibly false. These links between not, possible, and necessary, they have formal rules.
Good.
We also bump into soundness and completeness. A system is sound if everything you can prove in it is actually genuinely true in all those interpretations.
So the proofs are reliable.
Exactly. And it's complete if everything that is true across all interpretations can also be proven within the system.
So it captures all the truths.
Pretty much. These help us judge how well our logical tools, match up with our gut feeling about truth and consequence.
Okay, so if an argument isn't valid, how do we show that? How do we find the crack in the logic?
That's where countermodels come in handy.
Countermodels, right.
If an argument isn't valid, we can build a specific interpretation, a hypothetical setup, where all the starting points, the premises, are true, but the conclusion is false. That one single counterexample, it proves the argument doesn't work universally.
It's like finding that one edge case where the rule breaks down.
Precisely. You find that possible world where the logic fails.
Got it. Now, something else in the sources is how identity works in these systems. I mean, isn't identity just simple? A thing is what it is. How does that get complicated?
You'd think so. And yeah, in standard logic, identity like AA seems straightforward. But when you bring in possibility and necessity modal logic, things get a bit more subtle.
How so?
We start distinguishing between necessary identity and contingent identity.
Okay.
Necessary identity means if two things are the same, they have to be the same in every possible scenario. Like if Superman is Clark Kent, they are necessarily the same guy no matter what.
Right. One and the same being.
But contingent identity, that means two things just happen to be the same right now in our world, but they could have been different.
Right.
Think about, say, this specific lump of clay. Right now, it's shaped like a cat. But that very same lump of clay could have been shaped like a dog, right? The identity of the lump shaped like a cat is contingent.
I see. It didn't have to be a cat.
Exactly. And the rules for necessary identity, they can actually be shown to be complete in certain logical systems dealing with necessity. Contingent identity, though, needs a more complex way of thinking about interpretations, tracking objects across scenarios.
That sounds complicated.
It can be. It leads into quite advanced stuff like quantified non-normal modal logics. That's where you're dealing with some, possibly necessarily, in ways that, bend the standard modal rules.
Wow. Yep.
It's another layer, really exploring what sameness even means across different possibilities.
Definitely adding a what-if layer to something I thought was solid ground.
Yep.
Okay, another term that came up, intuitionistic logic. How does that fit into this non-classical picture?
Intuitionistic logic. It's a really different perspective on truth. Instead of just assuming every statement is either true or false.
Which is the classical way, right? The excluded middle.
Exactly. Intuitionism ties the truth of a statement to whether we can actually prove it. or construct evidence for it.
This is more about demonstration.
Precisely. It's often called a sublogic of classical logic. Anything provable intuitionistically is also true classically, but not always the other way around.
Interesting.
And what's really fascinating is that intuitionistic mathematics can sometimes end up saying things that look contradictory from a classical viewpoint.
How does that happen?
Because of that strict proof requirement. Take the law of double negation classically. If something isn't not true, it must be true.
Right. If it's not false, it's true.
Intuitionism doesn't always accept that. Just because we haven't managed to prove something is false doesn't automatically give us the constructive proof needed to say it's definitely true.
So it's like a more rigorous, show me the evidence, show me the construction kind of logic.
That's a good way to put it. It prioritizes what we can actively demonstrate over just relying on that principle of excluded middle.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Now, let's get into the really weird stuff, the limits of thought, where our reasoning seems to hit a wall or even contradict itself. Beyond the limits of thought mentions Kant's antinomies. What were those about?
Kant's antinomies are basically pairs of arguments. Each argument seems perfectly logical on its own, but they lead to completely opposite conclusions about really fundamental things, like the universe.
For example?
Well, one antimony argues the universe must have a beginning in time. Seems reasonable. But another equally strong argument claims it cannot have a beginning.
Yikes. So what was Kant's take?
His idea was that these contradictions pop up because we're trying to use our normal ways of understanding the world, our concepts on things that are fundamentally beyond our experience, what he called noumena, or things in themselves.
Things we can't directly perceive.
Right. So the antinomies show how our reason can kind of tie itself in knots when it tries to grasp ultimate reality, hitting inherent limits.
And then there's Zeno's paradoxes. Achilles and the tortoise, that famous one. How did these old puzzles show the limits of thought?
Zeno's paradoxes, especially the ones about motion and infinity, they really mess with our intuitions, don't they?
Totally. Appeal should win, obviously.
Right. But the paradox suggests the faster runner can never overtake the slower one with a head start. Because Achilles has to reach where the tortoise was, but by then the tortoise has moved on a bit, and so on, infinitely.
It feels like a trick, but it's hard to pinpoint why.
Well, Aristotle tried to solve them by distinguishing between potential infinity, like a line can be divided infinitely, and actual infinity, like an actual infinite number of points existing all at once.
Did that fix it?
Not entirely. The paradoxes still make us question infinity, continuity, space, time. They highlight how our everyday gut feelings can clash with what seems like logical reasoning about reality's structure.
Okay. We also saw Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. Relativism. How does that fit in?
Protagoras' idea, or at least how Plato presents it, is that truth isn't absolute or independent. It's relative to each person.
So what's true for me is true for me. What's true for you is true for you.
Basically, yes. It completely undermines the idea of a single objective truth out there for everyone. Protagoras seemed to argue that our perceptions are always reliable for us. They're our direct experience.
So if I feel cold, I am cold in my reality, even if you're sweating.
That's the gist. It raises huge questions about whether there's a shared reality we all tap into, or if our own experiences define our own truths.
Okay, the deep dive also mentions Anselm's argument for God, Berkeley on unconceived things, Kant's noumena again. What's the common thread connecting these different philosophical puzzles to the limits of thought?
In all these cases, you see philosophers trying to grasp something really fundamental, something maybe beyond direct experience, God's existence, mind versus reality, things in themselves. And when they push their arguments to the limit, they seem to run into contradictions. Anselm tries to prove God exists just from the concept of God, but critics say this leads to needing God to be both conceivable and somehow beyond conception.
A contradiction.
Yeah. Berkeley argued that trying to even think about something that nobody is thinking about is contradictory because you're thinking about it in that moment.
Right.
And Kant's noumena, being outside our understanding by definition, end up seeming contradictory when we try to reason about them. They all suggest our thinking tools might break down at the edges of cognition.
And then we hit the real logical bombshells. Cantor on infinity, Russell's paradox. How did these shake things up for maths and logic?
Oh, massively. Cantor showed there isn't just one infinity, there are different sizes. His diagonalization proof demonstrated that the collection of all subsets of a set is always bigger than the set itself.
Bigger infinities.
Yeah, and that led to paradoxes, like the collection of all ordinal numbers. If it existed, it would have to be the biggest ordinal, but also bigger than itself, a flat-out contradiction.
Okay.
And Russell's paradox, that came from thinking about a specific set, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members.
Right, I've heard this one. It's a brain twister.
Totally. Ask, does this set contain itself? If it does, well, its definition says it shouldn't. But if it doesn't, its definition says it should.
Either way, contradiction.
Exactly. Boom. It showed a massive flaw in the naive set theory mathematicians were using. Sent shockwaves, really. Made everyone realize they needed much stricter foundations.
I also saw parameterization mentioned as a way to handle contradictions. What's that about?
Parameterization is like a strategy, a general technique. You try to dissolve an apparent contradiction by saying the contradictory properties apply in different ways or under different conditions.
How's that work?
Like, if something seems both hot and cold, you might say, okay, it's hot temperature-wise, but cold emotionally. You add parameters.
You specify how it has the property.
Right. So if you have x is p and x is not p, you try to find parameters r1 and r2. So it's x is p regarding r1 and x is not p regarding r2. It tries to make the direct contradiction vanish.
Doesn't always work.
Well, Priest points out it's not a magic bullet. Sometimes it feels like it just shifts the paradox somewhere else.
And then there's Gödel, his incompleteness theorem. Always sounds super intimidating. How does that connect to paradox?
Gödel's theorem is profound. In essence, it shows that any formal system strong enough to do basic arithmetic will contain statements that are true, but you can't prove them within that system.
True, but unprovable.
Exactly. And the proof itself is ingenious. It involves creating a self-referential statement very much like the liar paradox.
This sentence is false.
Kind of like that, yeah. Gödel's statement effectively says, this statement is not provable in this system.
Okay.
Now think, if the system could prove it, it would be proving its own unprovability, contradiction.
Right.
So the statement must be unprovable within the system, but if it's unprovable, then what it says, I am unprovable, is actually true.
Wow. True but unprovable.
Yes. Gödel revealed these inherent limits of formal systems and showed this deep link between truth, proof, and those self-referential paradoxes.
That is a lot to take in. Okay, let's switch to something that sounds even more radical. Dialetheism. The idea that some contradictions can actually be true.
Yes, dialetheism. Graham Priest is the main proponent here. It is, quite simply, the view that some statements of the form A and not A are genuinely true.
That flies right in the face of basic logic, doesn't it? The law of non-contradiction?
It's a direct challenge to it, yes. The law says A and not A can't both be true. Dialetheists say, well, sometimes they are.
And they point to things like the liar paradox.
Exactly. This sentence is false. If it's true, its content holds, so it's false. If it's false, its content doesn't hold, so it's not false, meaning it's true.
It seems to force you into saying it's both.
That's the dialetheist argument. They look at that loop and say, yep, it's both true and false. It's a true contradiction.
But hang on. If one contradiction can be true, doesn't that just break everything? Doesn't that mean anything goes? Everything becomes true. Isn't that trivialism?
That's the absolute key objection, a very natural one. But dialetheists argue no. Just because some contradictions are true doesn't mean all are. Trivialism, the idea everything is true, means no distinctions, truth and falsehood collapse. That's obviously not right based on experience.
So how do they stop the logic exploding?
They work with paraconsistent logics. These are logical systems specifically built to handle contradictions without everything falling apart.
How?
They basically block or restrict the rule called explosion, the classical idea that from a contradiction, A and not A, you can logically derive absolutely any other statement B.
So contradictions are sort of contained. They don't infect the whole system.
Exactly. Paraconsistent logics provide the tools to reason consistently, even if you accept some contradictions exist. They prevent the whole system collapsing into nonsense. Priest himself has done a lot of work developing these logics.
So what do dialetheists think about the law of non-contradiction overall? Just throw it out.
Not at all, actually. They see it as, generally very reliable, super useful for everyday reasoning and describing most of the world.
But not absolute.
Right. They argue it's not universally true. There are exception-specific, maybe unusual cases like those paradoxes we talked about, especially involving self-reference, limits of thought. That's where it breaks down, and contradictions might actually hold.
So it's a strong general rule with some very specific edge case exceptions.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
And the liar paradox is their exhibit A for a true contradiction.
It's definitely a prime candidate. They argue the analysis just leads you there. If true, then false. If false, then true. They embrace that outcome. It is both true and false. Some even say the very features that make us call it a paradox are what make it a true contradiction.
This is really messing with my logical intuitions.
Right.
All right, let's change angles slightly. How does all this connect to truth and meaning? Frege said the meaning of a sentence is its truth conditions.
Right. Frege's idea was huge. To know what a sentence means is to know when it would be true. Theories of meaning often build on this. Possible worlds semantics defines meaning by the set of worlds where a statement is true. Even verificationism, linking meaning to proof, still relies on truth, just a provable kind of truth.
And the T-scheme. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
That's fundamental, too, linking the sentence to its truth condition. It's core to meaning and reference. But non-classical logics, especially dialetheism, complicate this picture.
How?
Well, if sentences can be both true and false, our understanding of truth conditions has to get more complex, doesn't it? It challenges that simple binary view underlying many theories of meaning. We need to rethink that connection.
And what about rational belief? The sources mentioned it might be rational to hold inconsistent beliefs. That sounds crazy.
It does sound counterintuitive, logically speaking, but think about real life. We often have messy, incomplete, conflicting information.
True.
Maybe it's psychologically understandable, maybe even useful sometimes, to hold beliefs that, if you laid them all out formally, would contradict each other.
Like,
Like, you think you turned off the stove, you have a clear memory. But you also have this nagging worry you think maybe you didn't. Believing both I turned it off and I might not have turned it off seems contradictory.
yeah.
But in that uncertain moment, holding both might be a rational response to your conflicting internal states, right? Dialetheists might even say that sometimes, like with paradoxes, inconsistent beliefs could reflect an underlying contradictory reality.
And chunking beliefs.
Yeah, that's like mentally compartmentalizing, keeping sets of beliefs separate. Each set might be consistent internally, but different sets might contradict each other. It's a way people manage conflicting info without total meltdown.
We also touched on the limits of expressibility. What sorts of things might be beyond words?
Well, think about trying to define consciousness or qualia, the raw feeling of red or pain. Many philosophers feel these subjective things are hard, maybe impossible, to pin down fully in objective language. Frege himself thought the nature of a concept was fundamentally different from an object, and trying to talk about concepts as if they were objects leads to problems.
Think Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein, in his early work, The Tractatus, made this famous distinction between what language can say and what it can only show. He thought fundamental truths about reality's structure couldn't be stated in language, but were shown by how language works.
So trying to talk about the deepest things might just hit the limits of language itself.
That's the idea. The tools might not be fit for the job, leading to paradox or incoherence.
Okay, near the end, the sources mention other ways to deal with paradoxes, happy face and unhappy face solutions, and Zalta's logic. How do these stack up against dialetheism?
Right, so the happy face solutions for the liar try to say the sentence is somehow broken. Meaningless, maybe, or not really making a claim. Diffuse the bomb.
Okay.
Unhappy face solutions see the paradox as a symptom of a deeper problem with our concepts of truth or language. Something's gone wrong.
And dialetheists?
They reject both. They say, no, the liar is a well-formed argument, it does lead to a contradiction, and we should just accept that the contradiction is true.
Embrace the paradox.
Pretty much. Now, Zalta's logic is totally different. It's a classical approach. It uses a distinction between exemplifying a property, like this ball is red, and merely encoding it. Like, Sherlock Holmes encodes the property of being a detective, but doesn't exemplify it because he's fictional.
How does that help with contradictions?
It allows apparently contradictory things. An object could encode being round and also encode being square without exemplifying both, which would violate non-contradiction. So it preserves the classical law at the level of exemplification.
Clever.
And there's also a distinction between metaphysical dialetheism, reality itself is contradictory, and other paraconsistent views where maybe only our belief or theories are inconsistent, not reality itself.
Lots of different angles.
Vastly.
Quasi-Validity and the disjunctive syllogism, that's P or Q, not P, therefore Q. How does dialetheism mess with that?
Okay, disjunctive syllogism seems rock solid in classical logic, right? Always works.
Yeah.
But for a dialetheist, it's only quasi-valid, not strictly valid. Why? Because if it's possible for P and not P to both be true...
The contradiction.
Exactly. Then even if you know P or Q is true, and you also know not P is true, you can't be absolutely sure Q must be true. Maybe the reason P or Q is true is because P is true, as part of that true contradiction P and not P. Q could still be false.
So the inference isn't guaranteed anymore if contradictions are allowed.
Precisely. A quasi-valid inference is one that usually works, perhaps because the specific contradiction needed to make it fail is considered unlikely or rejected in context. But it's not universally foolproof if dialetheism holds.
Wow, okay. Let's try and pull this together. It feels like non-classical logic, and especially Priest's dialetheism, it forces a major rethink of our most basic ideas about logic and truth.
I think that's fair to say. We've seen these frameworks where contradictions aren't automatically disastrous, challenging the absolute status of the law of non-contradiction. And paradoxes. They're not just quirky puzzles. They might point to real limits in our thought, our language. Dialetheism offers this radical path. Maybe some contradictions are just true.
Yeah, for me, the big aha moments were seeing how it all connects truth, negation, paradox, meaning, even rational belief. It's all tangled together.
It really is.
And just the possibility of true contradictions, the fact there's a serious debate about something as fundamental as non-contradiction, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Hopefully this gives you, the listener, a real sense of these alternative logical worlds, how they can offer some pretty profound insights into truth, reason, and maybe where our understanding hits its limits. Exploring paraconsistency, dialetheism, Priest's work, it's a deep and challenging area.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Is our intuitive rejection of contradiction, that feeling that it must be wrong, is that reflecting a fundamental truth about reality itself? Or is it maybe just a deeply learned habit of thought, a way we structure things that might actually be limiting us from seeing things differently? Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.